Hey guys, tonight we begin a story unlike any other. The tale of a sultan whose hunger for pleasure outshone his duty, whose palace became a theater of scandal, and whose legacy is remembered not for victories, but for the strange and dangerous excesses of his desires. This is the story of Ibrahim the Mad, the Ottoman Sultan, and the 280 concubines who lived in his gilded prison. Story of power, obsession, betrayal, and madness. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here now. Settle back, let the day soften, and slip away. Imagine yourself drifting into the old world, the Istanbul of the 17th century, the great Ottoman Empire, stretched from Hungary to Arabia, from Egypt to the Balkans, its heart beating in the magnificent city once known as Constantinople. The Bosphorus shimmered under the moonlight, dividing Europe and Asia, carrying ships heavy with silk, spices, and whispers, and at its center stood the Topkapi Palace, a labyrinth of domes and courtyards, tiled halls and perfumed chambers, guarded by eunuchs in crimson robes. Inside those walls was a world hidden from the common eye, the harem, not just a collection of women, as outsiders imagined, but an entire city within a palace. There were hundreds of rooms, courtyards, fountains, kitchens, schools. Eunuchs served as gatekeepers. Mothers and daughters lived under careful watch. Girls from distant lands were trained in music, poetry, and dance. Many were captives, gifts, or tributes from conquered lands. Their fate was to wait, perhaps for the Sultan's gaze to fall upon them, perhaps to wither unseen. And reigning over this maze of silken chambers was Ibrahim the Sultan. Born in 1615, he was the son of Sultan Ahmed I, and the younger brother of Murad for one of the fiercest and most feared rulers the empire had known. Where Murad was strict, violent, and merciless, Ibrahim was fragile, fearful, and impressionable. He spent much of his youth locked away in the caves. The cage, a secluded palace apartment where potential heirs were confined to prevent plots and assassinations. For years, Ibrahim lived in isolation, surrounded by silence and suspicion, never certain if each sunrise would bring his execution. When Murad IV died in 1640, the empire expected Ibrahim to inherit the throne, but he refused. He trembled, believed it was a trick, that his brother was still alive, waiting to lure him into the open. It was only after the body of Murad was shown to him that Ibrahim agreed to emerge from his cage. He was crowned Sultan at the age of 25. And with his release came something else, a ravenous hunger. Years of confinement had twisted him, starved of freedom, of companionship, of touch. Ibrahim hurled himself into the pleasures of the harem with desperate abandon. This was no ordinary indulgence. The harem swelled under his command. Historians claim he gathered as many as 280 concubines, women from Greece, Circassia, Persia, and beyond. A kingdom of beauty, all bent to his will. For Ibrahim, the harem was not simply a sanctuary of affection, it was a stage, a theater of scandal. He reveled in creating scenes, in bending reality into the shape of his fantasies. Picture the chambers by lamplight, silken curtains drawn, air heavy with rose oil and musk, jewels glittering against bare skin. And in the center, Ibrahim, a man desperate to taste life in every form, no matter how twisted, no matter how scandalous. Servants whispered of his strange appetites. He was said to demand his concubines act out elaborate performances, sometimes playful, sometimes cruel. He adored women of unusual beauty, even women whose size others mocked. His most famous mistress, Zivikar, was said to be a voluptuous woman of Armenian or Greek origin, whose charm and confidence bewitched him utterly. Ibrahim lavished her with jewels, clothes, palaces. He called her his sultaness of the harem. But there were darker tales too. Rumors that he ordered the palace stables lined with velvet so he could watch horses in luxury. Whispers that he filled pools with perfume instead of water. And, more sinister, the story that he once ordered his concubines stripped and paraded before him, choosing which would live and which would be discarded. Whether these tales are truth or exaggeration, they reflect how Ibrahim was remembered, as a man ruled by desire, a sultan whose empire crumbled under the weight of his appetites. Outside the palace, life was far from decadent. The empire struggled with war and debt. Corruption spread through the provinces. Janissaries, the elite soldiers of the sultan, grew restless and rebellious. The treasury was drained. Famine and plague haunted the cities. But inside, Ibrahim did not see. Or perhaps he did not wish to see. Empire could burn, and still he would lie back among cushions, demanding another story, another song, another woman to feed his obsession. This disconnection between ruler and ruled became the seed of his undoing, because in the shadows of the court, enemies were gathering. Viziers whispered of his madness. The Janissaries mocked him behind closed doors. And his mother, Cakesum Sultan, one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history, began to wonder whether her son was fit to rule at all. But for now, in these early years, the scandal was still contained within the palace walls. For now, Ibrahim enjoyed his kingdom of women, his endless theater of concubines. Imagine it. The faint sound of fountains in marble courtyards, soft rustle of silk as women walked in procession. The low hum of music, the oud, the ney, the tambourine. And above it all, the voice of the Sultan, commanding, praising, demanding. The harem was his universe. And in that universe, scandal bloomed like flowers left too long in the sun. One of the most infamous episodes would come later, the drowning of concubines in the Bosphorus, ordered in a fit of jealousy or paranoia. But even before that, the seeds of cruelty were sown. Ibrahim was known to lavish gifts, and then, in sudden fits of rage, strip them away. He was mercurial, swinging from adoration to fury. Concubines feared and adored him in equal measure. Some sought only survival. Others schemed for power, knowing that the Sultan's affection could turn them into queens, if only for a season. And through it all, the empire grew restless. The contrast between the Sultan's pleasures and the people's suffering became impossible to ignore. But that reckoning, that would come later. For now, the palace remains cloaked in mystery. The harem sleeps, though never fully at rest. And the Sultan lies awake, dreaming of fantasies too scandalous for daylight. The story of Ibrahim the Mad has only begun. In each chamber of his palace hides another secret. The palace walls had seen many sultans, fierce warriors, wise rulers, men who bled and brawled to keep the empire alive. But none had ever ruled quite like Ibrahim. For him, the throne was not a seat of responsibility. It was a throne draped in velvet, turned toward a stage where desire and power mingled in ways that scandalized even his closest courtiers. At the center of this theater of pleasure was one woman. Her name was Zivikar. History blurs her origins. Some say she was Greek, others Armenian, but all agreed on one thing. She was unlike the others. Loud. She was bold, voluptuous, confident, unafraid to wield her beauty like a weapon. Where other concubines bowed and trembled, Zivakar laughed. She charmed, teased, and refused to be just another face in a crowd of 280 women. Ibrahim noticed. And once he noticed, he could not look away. Imagine the harem's long-tiled halls, filled with hundreds of women waiting, jeweled and perfumed, their eyes cast downward as the Sultan passed. But when he approached Zivakar, she met his gaze directly. A forbidden act, yet one that delighted him. In her boldness, he found something intoxicating. She became his favorite, his obsession, his sultaness of the harem. He drowned her in gifts. Necklaces heavy with emeralds, dresses woven with gold thread, rings sparkling with diamonds the size of pearls. Entire palaces were granted to her, with servants to wait upon her every breath. She was no longer just a concubine. She was a queen in all but name, but power in the harem was never without danger. Every gift given to Zivakar was a wound to the others. The women whispered, plotted, grew envious. Because in the harem, survival depended on attention. A night with the Sultan could mean a lifetime of security, or the difference between obscurity and power. Yet Zivakar thrived in this treacherous world. She understood Ibrahim's madness, perhaps even encouraged it. Some say she fed his strangest desires, whispering fantasies into his ear that blurred the line between passion and cruelty. And Ibrahim followed. For a man locked away for most of his life, denied love and touch, he now devoured every experience, no matter how scandalous. It was during this time that the Sultan's strangest whims grew bolder. One tale tells of Ibrahim ordering the palace fountains filled with rosewater and musk, so the air itself became intoxicating. Another claims he had the stables lined with silk, just so his prized horses would never feel discomfort. He demanded the harem bathe in milk, or in honey, as though their skin might soak up sweetness itself. And always, Zivakar was at the center. She was said to have a gift for storytelling. In the quiet of night, while candles flickered and the Bosphorus shimmered outside the palace windows, she would tell him tales of ancient queens, of forbidden lovers, of men undone by beauty. Ibrahim would lie beside her, listening, enthralled, as though history itself had come alive in her voice. But her influence was dangerous, because Ibrahim trusted her more than his viziers, more than his generals, more than his mother. Kaxim Sultan, the formidable woman who had once ruled as regent and still wielded immense power. Kaxim watched carefully. She knew what unchecked women in the harem could do. She herself had climbed from concubine to queen mother using wit, beauty, and cunning. She saw in Zivakar a rival, someone who might twist Ibrahim's weakness for her own gain. She was not wrong. The empire outside the palace was faltering. Wars drained the treasury. Janissaries grew restless, demanding pay and privileges. Peasants starved as famine spread. The people whispered of their sultan, not with reverence, but with ridicule. They called him Ibrahim the Mad, mocking his obsession with women and jewels while the empire crumbled. But inside the palace, Ibrahim paid little attention. He was lost in his harem where Zivakar reigned like a shadow queen. The women of the harem became pawns in a game larger than themselves. Some plotted to poison Zivakar. Others schemed to win Ibrahim's favor. Eunuchs passed secret notes, carrying whispers between chambers. Alliances shifted like sand. Because in this world, beauty was currency, and affection was power, and Ibrahim himself grew more unpredictable. At times he was gentle, generous, almost childlike in his affection. He would laugh loudly, shower his favorites with gifts, and embrace them with a hunger that seemed endless. But at other times, he was cruel. His rages were sudden, violent, terrifying. He would banish concubines for the smallest slight, or worse, condemn them to death on a whim. The most infamous scandal was yet to come. The mass drowning of concubines in the Bosphorus, ordered by Ibrahim himself. But even before that, the women lived in constant fear, 'cause in the harem, beauty could save you, but it could also destroy you. One evening, Zivikar is said to have suggested a test of loyalty. She whispered to Ibrahim that the concubines should prove their devotion by plunging into the cold waters of the palace pools at his command. Whether the story is truth or legend, captures the danger of the harem under Ibrahim. Affection twisted into cruelty, love poisoned by fear. Outside, the viziers grew more alarmed. They saw the empire slipping, saw rebellions brewing, saw foreign powers waiting like wolves at the gate. Yet when they approached Ibrahim, he dismissed them. He laughed, waved his jeweled hand, and returned to the harem. For him, the empire was not its borders or armies. The empire was the harem, its silken chambers, its perfumed nights, its endless supply of beauty and desire. And so, night after night, the palace became a theater of scandal. The Sultan and his concubines played their dangerous games. Secrets were traded as often as caresses. The empire groaned under the weight of war and famine, and still within those walls the music played on. Zivikar, ever watchful, continued to rise. She saw her rivals fall, one by one. She gathered allies among the eunuchs, among the women, even among certain viziers, who saw in her a useful tool. She was not merely the Sultan's favorite, she was becoming something greater. In Ibrahim, he grew ever more lost in her. They called her his poison, his downfall, his greatest passion. And as the empire trembled, it became clear. This story would not end in love. No. It would end in blood, in betrayal, in the cold waters of the Bosphorus. But for now, the Sultan still dreamed, and the harem still whispered. The scandal was only just beginning. The harem shimmered with candlelight, perfume lingered in the air, thick and heavy. The fragrance of roses mingled with amber and musk. Yet beneath the sweetness lay something sharper. The bitter tang of fear, the women knew. Ibrahim's moods shifted like the sea. Tonight he might embrace you, drape jewels across your neck, whisper pet names into your ear. Tomorrow he might order you gone, or worse. Whispers drifted from chamber to chamber. The women told stories in hushed tones of favorites who rose too high, too quickly, only to vanish without a trace. Eunuchs avoided their eyes, carrying trays of sherbet and wine, pretending not to hear. Everyone in the palace understood the truth. Survival depended not only on beauty, but on luck, and on the Sultan's fragile state of mind. And Ibrahim's mind was unraveling. His obsession with Zivikar grew into a madness that blinded him. He demanded her presence at nearly every hour of the day. He refused to eat unless she was seated beside him. He rejected petitions from his viziers, choosing instead to stroll with her through the gardens, where peacocks strutted under the cypress trees. The empire groaned under war and famine, yet Ibrahim's attention remained fixed on the harem. He showered Zivikar with palaces, fur-lined cloaks, and endless pearls, When she laughed, he laughed. When she frowned, he raged. Her rivals soon learned that even a single complaint about her could spell their ruin. But Zivikar was clever. She understood the power she held, and she wielded it with both charm and cruelty. She flattered Ibrahim, fed his desires, and whispered into his ear when decisions needed to be swayed. Rumors spread that no decree was signed without her touch. She was not a queen by title, yet she ruled like one in secret. And then came the scandal that sealed Ibrahim's name in history. One winter's night, as the Bosphorus lay dark and frozen beneath the moon, Ibrahim's paranoia boiled over. He had grown suspicious of the harem, convinced that the women plotted against him, conspiring with viziers, whispering with janissaries, perhaps even with his own mother, Sultan. Zivikar, sensing danger, stoked his fears. Some say she feared rivals would poison her. Others believe she sought to tighten her grip on Ibrahim's heart by isolating him completely. Whatever the reason, she whispered into his ear a suggestion so cruel, so twisted, that even in the scandal-ridden annals of Ottoman history, it remains infamous. She told him that the women could not be trusted, that they were spies, traitors, unfaithful to his love. She convinced him that the only way to ensure loyalty was to destroy them. And Ibrahim obeyed. He summoned the eunuchs. His command was simple: gather the concubines, every last one who had fallen from his favor, and lead them to the waters. The women, terrified and trembling, were herded through the palace corridors. Their jeweled slippers slapped against the marble floors. Some begged for mercy, clutching at the robes of their captors. Others were silent, resigned, their eyes wide with disbelief. The eunuchs led them to the edge of the Bosphorus. The night air was cold, the water black and merciless. And there, one by one, the women were bound, weighted, and cast into the sea. It is said that 280 concubines were drowned that night. Their cries echoed against the palace walls, then were swallowed by the dark waves. The water that had once glittered with the reflection of moon and torch now roiled with death. When dawn came, the Bosphorus carried its grim cargo downstream, a silent procession of silken bodies. Fishermen whispered of veils floating like ghostly banners, of bracelets and rings glinting among the reeds. Ibrahim, meanwhile, seemed unshaken. He returned to Zivikar's arms, as though the massacre were nothing more than another of his nightly entertainments. To him, it was proof of loyalty, proof that he would never be betrayed. To the empire, it was a scandal so shocking that even the most loyal subjects began to question his rule. The story spread beyond the palace walls. In the markets of Istanbul, men shook their heads in disbelief. Mothers pulled their daughters closer, whispering prayers that they would never be taken to the palace. The drowning became a symbol of Ibrahim's madness, a wound that could not be hidden. Sultan was horrified. She had seen sultans rise and fall, but never had she witnessed cruelty on this scale. She understood what the viziers already feared. Ibrahim was not merely eccentric, he was dangerous, to the empire, to his people, to his own throne. Yet Ibrahim seemed oblivious. He ordered new concubines to be brought to the palace, as though women were as easily replaced as silks or jewels. He laughed at banquets, showered Zivikar with gifts, and indulged in stranger whims. One tale claims he became fascinated by fur, demanding that every surface of the palace be covered in sable and ermine. Another insists he ordered the treasury emptied to buy exotic fish for his fountains, watching them swim while his subjects starved. The janissaries grew restless. They had tolerated eccentric rulers before, but this was something else. Their pay was late, their patience was thin, and their respect for Ibrahim had all but vanished. To them, he was no warrior, no leader. He was a man-child, lost in women and jewels, while the empire burned. And still, Zivakar remained at his side. The drowning of the concubines had cemented her power, for no rival dared challenge her now. She was untouchable, the Sultan's shadow queen. Yet her triumph came at a cost. The empire whispered her name with hatred. To many, she was the poison that had driven Ibrahim mad. And perhaps they were right. But the truth was darker still. For Ibrahim's madness ran deeper than desire. It was a sickness of the soul, a hunger that could never be satisfied. He could fill fountains with rose water, drown hundreds of women, drape himself in fur from head to toe, and still he would want more. And the more he demanded, the closer he drew to ruin, because outside the harem, the viziers were watching. The janissaries were watching, even his mother was watching, and soon they would decide. Ibrahim could not be allowed to rule forever. The scandal was no longer contained within the palace walls.
It was spreading.
Reaching the streets, the barracks, the very heart of the empire. And once whispers become shouts, once patience turns to rage, the Sultan's throne can crumble overnight. But Ibrahim, lost in silken shadows, could not see it. For him, the world was still the harem, and in that world, Zivakar still reigned supreme. The palace, though still perfumed with incense and heavy with velvet drapes, had changed. It was no longer the glittering stage for Ibrahim's pleasures. It had become a cage of whispers. The eunuchs moved silently through the marble halls, their steps softer than sighs, their eyes lowered, but their ears caught everything. Every rumor that fluttered like a moth in the lamplight, every sharp word murmured behind a screen,
Ow.
every tremor of discontent. And all of it led back to one truth. The Sultan's grip was slipping. The janissaries had grown restless. Their wages, once generous and punctual, now trickled late, stolen by palace extravagance. They were the empire's sword, its shield, the pride of centuries. Yet Ibrahim treated them as shadows.
All pouring gold not.
Into their hands, but into the endless whims of Zivakar and the harem. One cold evening, their patience shattered. In a smoky tavern tucked in the streets of Istanbul, janissary captains gathered, voices low. They spoke of the Sultan's madness, of fur-lined walls, of fountains stocked with rare fish, of the night when hundreds of women were drowned in the Bosphorus. The captains drank their wine slowly, letting the bitterness burn down their throats. Each man understood. Their oath was to the empire, not to one man. And the empire was dying, yet none of them dared act alone. Because Ibrahim was still the Sultan, the shadow of God on earth, so they turned their gaze toward a different figure, the Cake-Sim Sultan, the Valid, the mother, the spider at the center of the Ottoman web. She had seen it all. She had guided Ibrahim's father, Murad IV, through wars and campaigns. She'd balanced the treasury, fed the poor, kept the palace afloat with cunning and calm. Now, watching her son stumble into ruin, she knew the empire stood on a knife's edge. But Ibrahim was her blood, her flesh, her boy. She had raised him, soothed him in childhood, when he was hidden away in the caves. The cage where Ottoman princes were confined. She had once prayed that he would never see the throne, fearing what life in isolation had done to him. And yet, fate had placed the crown upon his head. Now she faced the bitter truth. The crown was too heavy for him. It was dragging the empire down into the abyss. In her private chambers, Cakesum wept. The flicker of oil lamps threw shadows across her face, deepening the lines carved by years of intrigue and grief. To dethrone a sultan was no small act. It was treason. It was sacrilege. But to do nothing, to allow Ibrahim's madness to continue, would mean the destruction of everything she had spent her life preserving. One by one, the viziers came to her. They bowed low, their voices trembling with both respect and fear. They begged her to act, to guide the empire once more. They whispered of Ibrahim's scandals, his excesses, his blindness to the suffering of his people, and she listened. She always listened. It was then that the plan began to take shape. Not open rebellion, not yet. That would spill too much blood. No, what was needed first was to strip Ibrahim of his illusions, to corner him gently like a bird in a gilded cage, until there was nowhere left for him to fly. But Ibrahim was not blind. He felt the tremors in the palace walls, though he could not name them. He accused his viziers of betrayal, sometimes in rages so violent that even Zivikar shrank from him. He locked himself in the harem for days, clutching his favorite concubines, as if their silken arms could protect him from the world outside. Yet the world was already pressing in. The people of Istanbul had begun to murmur. In the spice markets, women shook their heads over the price of bread, cursing the palace under their breath. In the harbor, fishermen remembered the night of the drowning, their eyes haunted by what they had seen floating in the morning tide. The empire was rotting from within, and so in the summer of 1648, the unthinkable happened. The Janissaries rose. They stormed the palace gates, their boots striking the stones like thunder. Their banners rippled in the wind, black and white against the sky. Cries rang through the city, not of celebration, but of fury. For the people were not merely angry with Ibrahim, they were ashamed of him. Inside the harem, chaos erupted. Eunuchs raced through the halls, their faces pale, urging the women to hide. Zivikar clung to Ibrahim, her voice high with panic, urging him to stand firm to call upon his guards. But the guards did not come. The empire's sword had turned against its master. Cakesum moved quickly. She met the Janissary leaders in the palace courtyard, veiled and solemn. They bowed to her, for even hardened soldiers respected the valid. Together, they struck the final blow. They declared Ibrahim unfit to rule. The palace rang with the sound of steel as Ibrahim's throne was stripped away. He was dragged from the harem, struggling, shouting, his silk robes tearing beneath the soldiers' hands. They carried him not to execution, not yet, but to the cafes, the same dark prison where he had spent his youth. And there the circle closed. Ibrahim, who had once tasted absolute power, now found himself again behind barred windows, pacing like a caged animal. He shouted for Zivikar, demanded her presence, begged for her touch, but she was gone. The viziers had seized her, torn her from her gilded chambers. Some say she was strangled with a silken cord, others claim she was drowned in the same waters that had swallowed her rivals. Either way, the Shadow Queen was no more. The empire exhaled, as though a poison had been purged. But for Ibrahim, the torment had only begun. In his narrow prison, the whispers haunted him. The women's screams on the Bosphorus, the laughter of Zivikar, the stern, silent gaze of his mother, blurred into nights. His meals were brought to him in silence. He tore at his clothing, wept into the shadows, clutched at the iron bars until his hands bled. He was no longer Sultan, was no longer Shadow of God. he was simply a man, broken, raving, abandoned. The viziers enthroned his son, a child of 6, as Mehmed IV. Cakesum once again guided the state, her veiled figure looming over the court like fate itself. The janissaries returned to their barracks, their honor restored. The markets reopened, the whispers dulled to sighs, yet still the city remembered, Bosphorus remembered. The night when silken flesh sank beneath its waves, the reign of the mad Sultan. And though Ibrahim still breathed, confined in his gilded cage, his name was already carved into the empire's memory, as the ruler who drowned his harem, who loved him madly, who destroyed himself in pursuit of desire. And soon, even his breath would be taken, for the empire was merciful in many things, but never in madness. The cafes was silent, but Ibrahim's mind was not. Within those narrow stone walls, his thoughts ran like wolves in the dark. He had once been Sultan, master of an empire stretching across continents. Now he was a prisoner, stripped of crown, stripped of silk, stripped of the illusions that had once shielded him from the truth. The air in his chamber was heavy. The windows were small, barred, and too high to look out of. The only view he had was a slice of sky, sometimes pale, sometimes star-dotted, but never close enough to touch. The empire was outside those walls, moving forward without him, forgetting him. But he could not forget. He remembered the taste of feasts that had once filled his palace. Saffron rice, candied almonds, sherbets poured into golden cups. He remembered the perfume of concubines, the rustle of silk gowns slipping onto the marble floor, the laughter of women who knew they held power even as they played at submission, and above all, he remembered her. Civicar, his jewel, his obsession, his downfall. He heard her voice in the stillness, whispering promises, teasing, commanding. He saw her eyes in the darkness, black pools shimmering with cunning. Sometimes he thought she was still alive, waiting for him just beyond the door. Other times he swore he smelled her perfume, musk and rosewater, drifting through the cracks in the stone. But she was gone, taken from him as ruthlessly as the throne had been. The eunuchs who brought his food kept their eyes lowered. They never spoke. They would slide the tray across the threshold, bow, and retreat into silence. It was as though Ibrahim had become a ghost while still alive. He raved sometimes, shouting at them to speak, to answer, to tell him news of his son, of the court, of the empire. But they never did. They left him to his madness. Madness gnawed at him. Nights were the worst. When the oil lamps guttered out and the chamber sank into blackness, the whispers grew louder. He heard the cries of the women drowned in the Bosphorus, hundreds of voices rising from the deep, calling his name. He pressed his hands over his ears, but the water still filled his mind. He felt it drag him down, 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 silk tangling around his limbs, lips filled with brine. He would wake screaming, clutching at the walls, sweat soaking through his garments. And always the memory of his mother's eyes haunted him. Cakesum, the valid Sultan, the woman who had given him life and who had taken his throne. She had not come to see him since the day he was locked away. Her silence was worse than her judgment. It was abandonment. It was betrayal. It was love twisted into something crueler than hate. Outside the cafes, the empire's life continued. Mehmed IV sat upon the throne, a child clutching the symbols of sovereignty. Cakesum stood behind him, guiding the viziers, issuing decrees in the boy's name. The Janissaries patrolled the streets again, their loyalty restored, but still the whispers of Ibrahim lingered. The people had not forgotten. They spoke of the mad Sultan in the markets, at the baths, in the coffee houses. They told stories of his fur-lined walls, his orgies of feasting, his obsession with women and with Zivica. Some told the tale of the drowning with pity, others with horror, others with morbid fascination. And in the palace the viziers worried, for Ibrahim still lived. And as long as he lived, he remained a danger. Madness could not erase the fact of his birth. He was still the son of Ahmadai, still of the Ottoman bloodline. There would always be those who might rally to his name, claim his imprisonment unjust, and stir rebellion in his favor. The empire could not risk it. So the decision was made. Quietly, ruthlessly, one evening, as the call to prayer faded over the city, footsteps approached Ibrahim's chamber. They were not the soft steps of eunuchs, nor the shuffle of servants. These steps were firm, heavy. The steps of men with purpose. Ibrahim heard the door creak open. He looked up from the floor, his eyes wild, his hair tangled. His garments hung loose around him, soiled and unkempt. He was a shadow of the Sultan he had once been. 3 men entered. They bowed, though not deeply. One carried a bowstring coiled in his hand. Ibrahim froze. He knew, as the Empire had sent for him at last. "No," he whispered. His voice cracked, dry from days of silence. "No, you cannot. I am Sultan." But his words rang hollow, even to himself. The men moved forward. One seized his arms, pinning him to the ground. Another pressed a knee into his chest. Ibrahim struggled, thrashing, his breath ragged with panic. For all his madness, the instinct to live still burned within him. The third man slipped the bowstring around his neck. It was silk, smooth, and merciless. Ibrahim cried out, but the sound was cut short. His hands clawed at the cord, his legs kicked against the stone. His eyes bulged, his face contorted. The world narrowed to a single, strangled gasp, and then silence. The men released their hold. Ibrahim's body slumped to the ground, lifeless. His mouth was frozen half open, as if still trying to protest. His eyes stared at nothing, the madness finally extinguished. The mad Sultan was dead. The bowstring coiled again was carried away. The men bowed once more, not to Ibrahim, but to the empire itself. Then they left, closing the door softly behind them. No fanfare followed. No ceremony. The death of a sultan who had drowned his harem, who had squandered the empire's trust, was not something to be celebrated. Yet the news spread quickly. By dawn, the city knew, and the people whispered again. Some wept, for he had been their ruler, however flawed. Others rejoiced, for the nightmare had ended. Most simply shook their heads, muttering prayers, and turned back to their daily struggles. In the palace, Cakesem sat alone. A letter lay on the table before her, written in a trembling hand. She did not need to open it. She knew what it said. Her son was gone. Tears burned in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She had chosen this path. She had allowed it. For the empire, survival. For the future, but a mother's heart does not forget. And in the quiet of her chamber, beneath the weight of power and loss, she whispered a prayer for Ibrahim's soul. The empire moved forward. Mehmed IV ruled under Kazem's watchful gaze. The Janissaries held their ground. The markets filled once more with saffron, silk, and spices. But in the depths of history, Ibrahim's name remained carved in stone, not for victories in war, not for wisdom in governance, but for madness, for scandal, for drowning his harem in a night of obsession and paranoia. He was remembered as Ibrahim the Mad, a ruler consumed by desire, a sultan undone by his own heart. And though centuries would pass, though empires would rise and fall, his story lingered. A tale of velvet and blood, of silk and death. A warning of how power, when chained to madness, can destroy not only the ruler, but everything around him. And so ends the reign of Ibrahim I, the shadow of God on earth, the prisoner of his own mind, the sultan who drowned his empire in scandal. The palace was quiet after Ibrahim's death, not in celebration, not in grief, but in the heavy stillness that follows a storm. The bowstring had done its work, and a sultan's reign ended not with a parade, not with the clash of armies, but with the whisper of silk against skin. In the heart of Topkapi, the officials moved swiftly. Ibrahim's body was washed, wrapped in linen, and buried without grand procession. The imams recited their prayers, and the marble stones of the imperial tomb received another son of Osman. Yet even there, among sultans and warriors, Ibrahim's presence felt different, more like a warning carved into history than an honored memory. The empire had survived him, but it had not escaped unscathed. Cakesome Sultan remained the real power, guiding her grandson Mehmed IV, who was still just a boy. She had steered one son to the throne, then another, and finally her grandson, always weaving her influence into the empire's survival. Her strength was the empire's strength. Her will was the empire's will. Yet even Cakesome knew that Ibrahim's ghost lingered. The palace whispers never ceased. Eunuchs, concubines, viziers, janissaries, all remembered the chaos of his reign. His hunger, his paranoia, his obsession with Zivakar, his drowning of the harem. They had seen the empire tremble at the will of one unstable man, and they carried that memory like a scar. The streets of Istanbul hummed with rumor. Men gathered in coffee houses and retold the tales of Ibrahim's madness with flourishes and exaggerations. Some swore he lined his walls with fur because he feared the cold of death. Others claimed he had once tried to feed his concubines jewels, mistaking gems for food. The stories grew stranger with every telling, as though the people themselves could not decide whether Ibrahim had been sultan or specter, ruler or fool. Yet beneath the laughter, beneath the scandal, there was unease. For if one sultan could fall so far, what of the next? If power could be corrupted by passion, by obsession, by madness, what protection did the empire truly have? The viziers in their council chambers tried to erase Ibrahim's shadow. They focused on rebuilding the treasury, strengthening the janissaries, restoring order to the provinces, and in every decision, in every debate, his memory was there,
Aloud.
a reminder of what unchecked desire could do. And in the harem, the women whispered too. The concubines who had survived the drowning lived with a constant fear. Every splash of water, every echo of footsteps in the marble halls reminded them of that night. They spoke of Zivakar in hushed tones, the woman who had bewitched a sultan, the woman who had risen from nothing to command an empire's heart, the woman whose death had marked the beginning of his end. To some, Zivakar was a witch. To others, a martyr of desire. To all, she was unforgettable. Cakesome, sitting in her private chambers, carried the weight of both sun and empire. She had orchestrated Ibrahim's removal, knowing his madness threatened everything the Ottomans had built. Yet when she closed her eyes at night, she still saw his face, a boy once fragile in the caves, a man once drowning in silks, a sultan once lost in love. She had saved the empire, but at the cost of her son. The years moved forward as years always do. Mehmed IV grew into his role. He would be remembered as Mehmed the Hunter, a sultan of forests and falcons rather than battlefields. His reign would be long, stretching decades. But the shadows of his grandfather Ahmed and his father Ibrahim never fully lifted. History remembers patterns, and in the Ottoman line, those patterns often repeated. Madness was not Ibrahim's alone. The case with its silence, its isolation, its suffocating loneliness, had birthed other rulers broken by solitude. Princes raised in fear, locked away for decades, emerged not as leaders but as haunted men. Ibrahim was the most infamous, but he was not the only one. Even so, his story stood apart, because his reign had not been merely quiet neglect or passive madness. It had been active chaos. Desire sharpened into obsession, paranoia turned into drowning waters, lust entangled with death. It had been a spectacle of ruin, and so his story spread beyond the empire itself. European ambassadors wrote of him in their letters. Travelers carried tales of the mad sultan back to Venice, Paris, London. Writers embellished them, turning Ibrahim into both villain and curiosity. In taverns and salons far beyond the Ottoman borders, his name was spoken with a mix of horror and fascination. Sultan who drowned his harem. A sultan bewitched by a concubine. A sultan undone by his own mother. It was a tale too rich for history to forget. Centuries later, Ibrahim's story would be retold again and again. Some would paint him as a tyrant, others as a victim of circumstance. Some would emphasize his madness, others his humanity. But all would agree on one thing. He had left a mark. The palace walls of Topkapi still stood, strong and gleaming, filled with the hum of daily life. Viziers plotted, concubines laughed, janissaries trained, imams prayed. Yet in the quietest corners, in the candlelit shadows of the harem, one could almost hear it still. The echo of silk against water. The whispers of drowned voices, the sigh of a sultan who had lost himself. Perhaps that is the true legacy of Ibrahim, not the empire he governed. For others ruled more wisely, not the battles he won. For his reign was not marked by conquest. Not the wealth he gathered, for the treasury emptied under his desires. His legacy was a warning, story whispered in the dark, a reminder that power without balance, without reason, without restraint, can unravel into madness. That even the most powerful man in the world can be undone by the smallest thread, a whisper of silk, flicker of perfume, the gaze of a single woman. The empire moved forward, but Ibrahim remained, trapped not in the caves, not in the grave, but in memory. The mad sultan, the shadow of God on earth, lost to his own shadows. The man who drowned his heart, his harem, and his empire in scandal. And so, in the silence of history, the story ends, not with triumph, not with redemption, but with a whisper. The whisper of water closing over silk. History is never a single story. It is a tapestry of repeating threads, patterns that twist and return, changing color yet remaining familiar. The reign of Sultan Ibrahim the Mad was not an isolated tale. It was part of a larger rhythm within the Ottoman dynasty, a rhythm shaped by power, fear, confinement, and the fragile minds of men raised in shadows. The empire was vast, stretching across 3 continents, a marvel of order and conquest. Its armies had once thundered through Europe, its ships had ruled the Mediterranean, its courts had dazzled with silken jewels. Dud. But behind the walls of Topkapi Palace, the heart of the empire beat not with strength, but with silence. The silence of the caves. This gilded cage was designed to protect the dynasty from fratricide. Princes were no longer executed at the accession of a new sultan. Instead, they were locked away, isolated for years, sometimes decades. They lived with books, tutors, and guards, but without sunlight, without the hum of the streets, without the rhythm of real life. When their time came, when fate thrust the crown upon their heads, they stepped into power not as seasoned men, but as strangers to the world. Some emerged cautious, some bitter, some broken, and a few, like Ibrahim, emerged mad. The caves was both sanctuary and prison. It preserved lives but shattered minds. Consider his brother Murad, for he had been fierce, ruthless, and unrelenting. Known for banning tobacco, coffee, and alcohol, Murad enforced his laws with his own sword. He walked the streets of Istanbul in disguise, cutting down offenders with his own hands. He died young, only 27, but his reign burned like a torch. Ibrahim followed, not with fire, but with chaos. He was the shadow cast by Murad's blaze. After Ibrahim came Mehmed IV, the child sultan, would reign for nearly 40 years, remembered for his hunts more than his wars. He was neither mad nor brilliant, neither tyrant nor fool. He was, perhaps, the compromise of fate, but the pattern continued. Later sultans would suffer the same confinement. Some would withdraw into melancholy, leaving power in the hands of viziers and mothers. Others would lash out in paranoia. The empire itself became a creature of these moods, rising when strong men ruled, stumbling when broken men inherited the throne. It is here that Ibrahim's story takes on deeper meaning. Not merely the tale of one man, but the reflection of a system. For power in the Ottoman court was never held by one alone. It was shared, fought over, stolen, and reclaimed. Cakesum Sultan, Ibrahim's mother, was one of the most powerful women of her age, shaping emperors and empires. After her, Turhan Sultan, mother of Mehmed IV, would wrestle for power. These women ruled from behind the lattice screens, their whispers heavier than swords. The harem was not merely a chamber of silk and perfume, it was a battleground. Concubines were pawns, sometimes queens. Eunuchs were both servants and kingmakers. Viziers rose and fell with the tide of palace intrigues. And at the center, always, was the Sultan, a man both absolute in authority and utterly captive to those around him. Ibrahim's madness exposed this balance with brutal clarity. He was Sultan, yet controlled by Zivakar, a concubine who held his heart. He was ruler of millions, yet bound by his mother, who chose his fate. Was absolute monarch, yet undone by viziers, who signed his death warrant. Even the most powerful man in the world was never truly free. It is tempting to see Ibrahim as merely grotesque. The fur-lined walls, the drowned concubines, the obsession with Sivakar's curves. But beneath the scandal lies something more human. the story of a man unprepared, overwhelmed, and consumed by loneliness. When European envoys wrote home about the mad Sultan, their words dripped with disdain. They mocked him as an Eastern despot, a barbaric fool, a figure of decadence. But they failed to see the mirror in their own courts. For was madness so foreign to kings of Europe? Was scandal unknown in Versailles or the palaces of Madrid? Were not English monarchs too undone by lust, paranoia, or rage? History repeats not only within empires, but across them. Perhaps that is why Ibrahim's story lingers. It is not only Ottoman history, it is human history. It is the tale of how desire can warp power, how isolation can warp the mind, how love can become destruction. And it is, too, a story of how memory transforms men into myths. For centuries after his death, Ibrahim's name was whispered with both horror and fascination. He was a warning and an entertainment, a tragedy and a scandal. His story was retold in chronicles, in gossip, in travelogues, in plays and novels. Each retelling shaped him anew. The real Ibrahim. The boy locked in the caves, the man who wept at his own coronation, the father of children who would never know him, faded. What remained was the mad Sultan, a figure larger than life, distorted by the lens of memory. Perhaps this, too, is the fate of rulers. To be remembered not as they were, but as they fit the story of their times. And so we end, as we began, in whispers. Whispers of silk against marble, of bowstrings in the night, of the muffled laughter of concubines who survived. Whispers of a mother's sorrow, a vizier's ambition, a child's inheritance. Whispers of an empire that rose and stumbled, again and again. The story of Ibrahim is finished, but the echo of it continues, carried down the corridors of Topkapi, across the waters of the Bosphorus, into the pages of history books, into the dreams of those who lie awake at night and wonder, how fragile is power, how strong is desire. What in the end do we truly remember, the man or the myth? Perhaps the answer is both. For in Ibrahim, we see not only the mad Sultan of the Ottomans, we see ourselves.